Number 10. The Tyrrhenian raids of Barbarossa, 1544. Hayreddin Barbarossa was not a pirate the way Blackbeard was a pirate. By 1544, he was Caputin Pasha of the Ottoman Empire, the naval commander-in-chief of the largest fleet in the Mediterranean, personally trusted by Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. But he had been born on the Aegean island of Lesbos as the son of a retired Sipahi, and he had come up through corsair raids under his older brother Aruj. The uniform had changed. The habit of stripping coastlines had not. In the spring of 1544, Barbarossa had wintered his fleet at Toulon in the south of France, an arrangement his French allies had granted under the extraordinary Franco-Ottoman alliance against Charles V of Spain. The Christian population of Toulon had been evacuated. The cathedral had been converted into a mosque, Ottoman coins circulated in the market stalls. It was a diplomatic scandal that shook Christendom, and Suleiman used the shock as cover. In May, Barbarossa was ordered home to Constantinople. He was not ordered to hurry. He was not ordered to take the direct route. He was told, in effect, to make his journey memorable. He left with 210 ships. The scale is worth pausing on. This was not a raiding party. This was a mobile city. Tens of thousands of oarsmen, marines, janissaries, and gunners moving down the western coast of Italy with permission to take whatever the Sultan's admiral felt like taking. His first stop was San Remo, on the Ligurian coast, which he sacked for the third time in a decade. Then he doubled back toward Genoa with the specific purpose of extracting his lieutenant Turgut Rice, who had been captured by the Genoese 4 years earlier and was serving as a chained oarsman on one of Andrea Doria's own galleys. Barbarossa did not besiege Genoa. He simply anchored his 210 ships in view of the harbor and let the Genoese contemplate them. Doria negotiated. 3,500 gold ducats bought Turgut's freedom, and the fleet moved on. Then came the Tyrrhenian coast. In June and July of 1544, Barbarossa fell on Elba, Piombino, Castiglione della Pescaia, Talamone, Orbitello, Montiano, Porto Ercole, and the Isle of Giglio. At Talamone, he tore open the tomb of Bartolomeo Peretti, the Christian raider who had burned Barbarossa's father's house on Lesbos the previous year, and scattered his bones. He was going to make the point personal. From there, the fleet turned south. The islands of Ischia and Procida fell inside a week. The city of Foria was carried off almost entirely. According to the priest Jerome Morand of Antibes, who was traveling with the French escort and kept a diary, roughly 6,000 captives were taken in a single sweep across Ischia, Lipari, and the surrounding coast. On Lipari alone, contemporaries reported that virtually the entire population was hauled away in chains. The effect on the Italian coast was not a season's tragedy, but a demographic reordering that lasted a century. Villages that had stood on the shore for 500 years picked up and moved inland, sometimes 5 or 10 kilometers, to escape the horizon that had eaten their neighbors. Watchtowers went up on every headland. The Kingdom of Naples raised a special corsair tax. The Papal States hired Knights of St. John to patrol the sea lanes. Fishermen learned to bring their families in at dusk and post lookouts on the church roof. When you drive the Tyrrhenian coast today and wonder why so many medieval villages sit half an hour uphill from the sea when their livelihood was fishing, the answer is Barbarossa. He arrived with 210 ships in 1544, and the villages moved. Barbarossa himself sailed on to Constantinople, was received with high honors, and died peacefully in his palace on the Bosphorus 2 years later. He is one of the few pirates in this list who died in a bed. His victims were still being ransomed out of Algiers a generation after he was buried. Number 9. Francis Drake in the mule train at Nombre de Dios, 1573. If the Barbarossa raids terrified a coast Drake's ambush of the Spanish silver train did something rarer. It shifted the balance of an empire. In the early 1570s, the Spanish crown was moving so much bullion from the mines of Potosi and Peru into Europe that the entire European price of silver was determined by how many mule trains crossed the Isthmus of Panama in a given year. The silver came up the Pacific coast to the port of Panama, was strapped onto mules 300 pounds at a time, and walked overland through the jungle to Nombre de Dios on the Caribbean, where the annual treasure fleet was waiting. The road was called the Camino Real. It was the artery of the Spanish Empire. It was also, by Drake's calculation, unguarded for long stretches through dense jungle, where 50 Spanish soldiers were meant to protect 190 mules. Drake, aged 32, was going to test the math. His first attempt on Nombre de Dios in July 1572 was a disaster. He led about 70 men through the streets by moonlight, seized the treasure house, and was then shot in the leg. He fainted from blood loss on the plaza. His men refused to leave without him and dragged him back to the boats empty-handed. Then came the worst part. His younger brother John was killed in a botched raid on a Spanish ship. His other brother Joseph died of yellow fever right after New Year's Day, 1573. Over a third of his crew died from disease that wet season. Any sensible captain would have gone home. Drake did the opposite. He rebuilt his alliance with the Cimarrones, escaped African slaves living free in the Panamanian interior, who knew every jungle trail the Spanish did not. He then partnered with a French Huguenot captain named Guillaume Letestu, who arrived with a small force and a personal grudge against Spain. Letestu gifted Drake a sword that had once belonged to King Francis I of France. In April 1573, this multinational raiding party of Englishmen, French Protestants, and escaped African slaves, roughly 60 in all, crept through the jungle to a bend in the trail about a league inland from Nombre de Dios and lay flat in the undergrowth. The mule train came into view carrying, in the Spanish accounting, over 100,000 pesos of gold, including 18,363 pesos of the emperor's own fine gold from Popayan, plus, in Drake's own accounting written later for Elizabeth, close to 30 tons of pure silver, 190 mules, each carrying 300 pounds. The Spanish guards did not hold. Only one Cimarron was killed in the ambush. Letestu was wounded, captured by Spanish reinforcements the next day, and beheaded. Drake and his men buried what silver they could not carry, sailed north into the Caribbean, and reached Plymouth Harbor on August 9th, 1573. When the news of what Drake had brought home reached the Parliament in London, the message was unmistakable. Spain could be robbed. Not just harassed, robbed on an imperial scale by one ship in a single afternoon. Elizabeth kept her distance in public and welcomed Drake in private. His share of the silver, and Spain's fury at England for pretending to know nothing about it, lit the fuse that would burn for the next 15 years. Drake was sent around the world in the Golden Hind and returned so laden with plunder that Elizabeth boarded his ship and knighted him on the deck. And in 1588, when Philip II of Spain finally sent the Armada north to end the piracy problem, once and for all, it was the son of a Devon farmer with a knighthood and a chip on his shoulder who helped scatter it. The raid on the mule train was the first drop. The Armada was the storm it grew into. Number 8. Zheng Yisao humbles two empires. If you name the most successful pirate of all time, most people will guess Blackbeard, or Henry Morgan, or Bartholomew Roberts. All of them combined did not command what Zheng Yisao commanded at her peak. She was born around 1775 in Guangdong, worked as a young woman on one of the floating brothels of Canton Harbor, and married the pirate Zheng Yi in 1801. Their marriage was a business partnership. She negotiated to co-command his fleet from the moment the ceremony ended. Zheng Yi died in 1807, either lost in a typhoon, or according to some accounts, blown overboard in a storm. She was 32 years old, a widow, and she inherited an operation of roughly 400 ships and 40,000 men. Within 3 years, she would double it. At the height of her power in 1808 and 1809, Zheng Yisao commanded what the Qing archives count as roughly 1,800 vessels and between 50,000 and 70,000 sailors, though some contemporary Western estimates put the figure closer to 80,000. To put that in perspective, Blackbeard, at his most feared, commanded 4 ships and about 400 men. The British Royal Navy, in the same decade, had roughly 140 ships of the line in commission. Zheng Yisao had more armed vessels under her flag than most nation-states. She organized the Confederation into 6 fleets by color, the red, yellow, green, blue, black, and white, and imposed a written code of pirate law so severe that theft from the common fund was punished by beheading and rape of a captive was a capital offense. Whether these codes were always enforced is a separate question. That they existed at all is why she outlived her rivals. In 1808, the Jia Qing Emperor decided the crisis had to end. The Qing Imperial Navy was assembled, Warships were built, and a squadron was sent to trap the Red Flag Fleet in the Pearl River Delta. Zheng Yi Sao did not run. She sailed directly for the Qing fleet, destroyed roughly half of it in the ensuing action, and captured dozens of imperial warships to add to her own hulls. The government of the largest empire on Earth was briefly unable to project naval power along its own coast. The Portuguese at Macau then tried where the Qing had failed. They sent squadrons from their Indian Ocean fleet. They blockaded her supply lines, and from September 1809 through January 1810, they fought a running campaign later called the Battle of the Tiger's Mouth. The Portuguese caused real damage. Even the British East India Company, whose ships had begun taking losses to the Confederation, decided to negotiate rather than fight, agreeing to a truce so their traders could pass unmolested. But Zheng Yi Sao was reading the wind. Her Black Flag Fleet, under a rival leader, quarreled with her Red Flag Fleet and defected to the Qing side. The pressure was accumulating. Rather than fight to the last hull, she did something no successful pirate had ever done. She walked into a Qing government building in Guangzhou in April 1810 and negotiated an amnesty on her own terms. She kept her fortune. Her second husband, Zhang Bao, her adopted son and lover, received a commission as a colonel in the Imperial Navy. Some 17,000 of her followers came in with her. The Confederation was disbanded, but nobody hanged for it. She then retired to Guangzhou, opened a gambling house, ran a salt smuggling business on the side, and died in bed in 1844 at the age of 69. She had humbled the Qing dynasty, humiliated the Portuguese Navy, blackmailed the East India Company into a peace treaty, and walked away with the money. The Qing had to conclude that fighting her was more expensive than pardoning her. That is the definition of winning at piracy. Number 7. Blackbeard's blockade of Charleston, May 1718. Every schoolchild who has ever heard the word pirate has heard the name Blackbeard. And yet the raid that made him famous had almost nothing to do with what most people picture when they picture a pirate. There was no boarding of a treasure galleon. There was no chest of doubloons. There was, instead, the largest and richest port in the American southern colonies, held hostage for a week over a shopping list. By May 1718, Edward Thatch, more commonly known today as Edward Teach, had been captain of the Queen Anne's Revenge for about 6 months. She was a former French slave ship, retrofitted with 40 guns, and Blackbeard sailed her at the head of a flotilla of 3 sloops crewed by roughly 400 men. This was not a lone pirate ship. This was a small navy. Blackbeard's partner in the enterprise was Stede Bonnet, the so-called gentleman pirate, a Barbados plantation owner who had abandoned his wife and turned to piracy for reasons no historian has ever fully explained. Together, they arrived off Charleston Harbor in mid-May and simply stopped the port. For the next 6 days, no ship entered or left Charleston without Blackbeard's permission. The pirates captured 8 or 9 vessels attempting to trade, including the Crowley, on which happened to be sailing Samuel Wragg, a member of the South Carolina Council, and his young son, William. Blackbeard took Wragg and roughly 60 other passengers as hostages. Then he sent 2 pirates ashore under a flag of truce with a demand for the governor. The demand was, on its face, bizarre. Blackbeard did not want gold. He did not want jewels. He wanted a chest of medicine. The historical record is not fully clear on why. The most commonly proposed explanation, based on the crew's likely condition after months in the Caribbean, is that the fleet was riddled with venereal disease and needed mercury preparations to treat it. Whatever the reason, the message to Governor Robert Johnson was blunt. Deliver the medicine chest within a fixed time, or the hostages would be beheaded and their heads sent ashore, and the ships in the harbor would be burned. The negotiation nearly went off the rails. The 2 pirate emissaries went ashore promptly, got drunk in a Charleston tavern, and disappeared for 3 days. Blackbeard, on his ship in the harbor, moved past the deadline. He came within hours of executing Wragg and his son. Finally, the chest was delivered. It weighed about 400 pounds and was worth an estimated 300 to 400 pounds sterling. Blackbeard released the hostages, but only after stripping them of jewelry coin and most of their clothing. Wragg and his son walked back into Charleston essentially naked. Not one hostage was killed, not one shot was fired at the town. And Blackbeard sailed away with exactly what he had asked for. It was the boldest single act of his career, and it was also the moment that convinced the British Crown that the pirate havens of the Atlantic coast could no longer be tolerated. Within 6 months, Blackbeard would be dead, killed at Ocracoke Island by a Royal Navy lieutenant named Robert Maynard, his head cut off and hung from the bowsprit of Maynard's sloop as it sailed back to Virginia. He got his medicine. He also got the entire British Empire's attention, and it decided he was a problem worth dying to solve. Number 6. The Sack of Baltimore, June 20th, 1631. The village of Baltimore sits on a rocky inlet in West Cork in the south of Ireland. In 1631, it was an English fishing colony of about 200 people, mostly settlers from Devon and Cornwall, who had come over to work the pilchard fishery. It was 3,200 kilometers from the North African coast. It was as far from the Mediterranean world of the Barbary corsairs as any settlement in Europe could reasonably be. And on the night of June 20th, in the space of about 2 hours, more than 100 of its inhabitants were dragged from their beds and vanished from history. The commander of the raid was Janzoon van Haarlem, a Dutchman from the port of Haarlem who had begun his career as a Dutch privateer against Spain, been captured in 1618 off Lanzarote, converted to Islam, taken a new name, Murad Race the Younger, and risen to command a substantial Barbary fleet based first at Saleh in Morocco and then at Algiers. He had already established a raiding base on the island of Lundy in the Bristol Channel between 1627 and 1631. From Lundy, he could strike anywhere on the Irish or Cornish coasts and be back at sea before word traveled by land. In the summer of 1631, he sailed north from Algiers with 2 ships, a 300-ton Dutch-built man-of-war carrying 24 guns and about 200 men, and a smaller consort with roughly half the ordnance. Off the coast of Ireland, he captured a fishing boat commanded by an Irishman named John Hackett from Dungarvan. Hackett offered his life in exchange, agreed to guide the raiders to a target. He talked Murad out of attacking Kinsale, which was fortified, and steered him instead to the softer prize of Baltimore. Just after midnight on June 20th, more than 200 armed corsairs came ashore in the cove. They moved through the village in silence, kicking in doors, dragging sleeping families from their beds, torching the thatched roofs behind them. It was not a fight, it was a harvest. By the time musket fire and drums from the main village alerted the surviving inhabitants, and Murad ordered the retreat, 107 people, according to the official English count, and possibly as many as 200 according to other sources, had been herded down to the boats. Most of them were the English settlers of the fishing colony. A few were Irish, the mothers, fathers, children, and elderly of an entire town, gone in the single tide. They were taken to the slave market at Algiers. The men were sold into galley slavery or hard labor. The women went into harems and domestic slavery. Of the 107 taken, the historical record can confirm only 3 who ever returned to Ireland, and 2 of those were ransomed 14 or 15 years after their abduction. The rest died in North Africa, wearing chains thousands of kilometers from a country whose name they eventually forgot how to speak. John Hackett, the guide, was hanged from the clifftop above Baltimore for treason. The village itself effectively ceased to exist. The surviving families packed up and moved inland to Skibbereen in Baltimore, did not recover its population for a century. Local conspiracy theories, still repeated in the pubs today, blame Sir Walter Coppinger, a Catholic lawyer who was locked in a long legal dispute with the O'Driscoll clan over the Baltimore fisheries, and who happened to benefit substantially from the settlers' vanishing. Whether Coppinger conspired with Murad or simply exploited the raid after the fact has never been proven. What is beyond dispute is that a single night in June 1631 emptied an entire English colony on the Irish coast and became the largest slave raid ever carried out by Barbary corsairs on the British Isles. Number 5. Henry Morgan at Portobello, July 1668. To understand why Portobello was worth risking 500 men to attack you, have to understand that it was one of the 3 great treasure ports of the Spanish Empire. Twice a year, when the treasure fleet came in from Spain, Portobello transformed from a sleepy port of 400 residents into a boom town of 10,000 traders, muleteers, and soldiers. The silver of Peru arrived from the Pacific side of the isthmus. The gold of Colombia and the emeralds of the interior were pooled here. And on paper, Portobello was protected by 3 stone castles, garrisoned by Spanish troops with a combined arsenal that in theory could turn any harbor approach into a killing ground. In practice, the castles were undermanned, the walls were patched, and the garrison was often paid late. Henry Morgan, then a 33-year-old Welshman with a commission from the governor of Jamaica, decided in the summer of 1668 that the theory did not matter. On July 11th, Morgan anchored his ships about 6 kilometers short of the town, out of sight from the castles. He transferred 470 men into 23 canoes. They paddled in silence to a point 3 kilometers from the outer castle and landed on foot at 3 in the morning. Morgan approached the first castle, San Felipe, from the landward side, which the Spanish had considered too jungle-thick to defend. A half hour before dawn, his men were over the wall and inside. The garrison was overwhelmed before it could form a firing line, and Morgan, in a decision that would follow him for the rest of his life, ordered the surviving Spanish defenders locked inside the powder magazine, which his men then set alight. Some accounts say he did this to save time. Some say it was pure calculated terror to speed the surrender of the other castles. The result was the same. San Felipe went up in a fireball, and the news traveled. The second castle fell almost immediately in the general panic. The third, Santiago, held. It was commanded personally by the Spanish governor of Panama, Don Jose Sanchez Jahenez, and it sat on a hill above the harbor with a clear field of fire on any assault force approaching from the town. Morgan's men suffered casualties on the first attempts. And it is here that the most notorious tactic of his career enters the record. According to Alexandre Exquemelin, the Dutch or Flemish surgeon who sailed with Morgan and later published a best-selling account of the Buccaneers, Morgan ordered the town's captured priests, monks, and nuns, along with other civilian prisoners, to be forced ahead of his assault force carrying the scaling ladders to the walls of Santiago. The idea, in Exquemelin's telling, was that the governor would not fire on his own clergy. The governor fired anyway. Several religious were killed on the ladders. The walls were breached. The governor was killed refusing quarter, and Portobello was Morgan's. When Exquemelin's book was translated into English in the 1680s, Morgan was by then Sir Henry Morgan, Deputy Governor of Jamaica, and he was furious. He sued the London publishers for libel, and he won. Subsequent English editions were forced to remove or amend the passage about the human shields. Whether Exquemelin invented the story to sell books, or whether Morgan won the case by simple force of legal muscle and reputation, is still debated by historians. What is not debated is what Morgan did once the town was his. His men occupied Portobello for a month. They tortured captives to reveal hidden valuables, a routine buccaneer practice for extracting the hidden strongboxes of any Spanish merchant town. Morgan demanded a ransom of 100,000 pieces of eight from the governor of Panama not to burn the town. The governor tried to send a relief column across the isthmus. Morgan ambushed and destroyed it. The ransom was paid. Morgan sailed back to Jamaica with a fortune that came to roughly 250 pieces of eight per man, which in 1668 was worth roughly 12 years of an ordinary sailor's wages. And he had proven that the great Spanish treasure port could be taken by a small force of buccaneers if the surprise was total. The lesson would send him back across the isthmus 3 years later. Number 4. Henry Morgan's March on Panama, 1671. In the annals of pirate history, there is only one raid that qualifies as a full military campaign, and this is it. In late 1670, Morgan assembled at Tortuga what was, on paper, the largest privateer force ever put to sea in the Caribbean, roughly 2,000 men in 37 vessels, drawn from every English, French, and Dutch buccaneer settlement in the region. His stated commission, from the governor of Jamaica, Thomas Modiford, was to defend the island against Spanish reprisals. In practice, it was a license to attack anywhere on the Spanish Main. What none of the buccaneers knew, and what Modiford almost certainly knew but did not admit, was that on July 8, 1670, England and Spain had signed the Treaty of Madrid, ending hostilities. Morgan sailed 5 months later. Whether he was informed and ignored the treaty, or whether the news had genuinely not reached Jamaica, has been argued for 350 years. He struck first at Old Providence Island, which fell by ruse. He then dispatched an advance force to storm Fort San Lorenzo at the mouth of the Chagres River, the fortress that guarded the only navigable route from the Caribbean side of the isthmus toward the city of Panama on the Pacific. The assault on San Lorenzo cost Morgan roughly 100 casualties. Of the fort's Spanish garrison, Of about 350, only 23 were taken alive. On January 18, 1671, with 1,400 men, Morgan began the March on Panama. It is 80 kilometers from the mouth of the Chagres to Panama City, between the two ley swamps, mountain jungle, Spanish scorched earth, and ambushes by native scouts working for the Spanish crown. Morgan's men traveled with almost no food. The buccaneers had assumed they would raid Spanish villages along the way and take supplies. The Spanish burned the villages ahead of them. By day 5, the buccaneers were eating leather from their bandoliers and their own belts, boiled in river water. Some were reported to have chewed grass. Morgan, according to ex-Wemlin, was seen personally kicking men to their feet who wanted to lie down and die. On the 9th day, they crested the last hill and saw Panama City below them, a city of 10,000 people, the richest Spanish settlement on the Pacific coast of the Americas, with warehouses full of Peruvian silver, Chinese silk, brought across the Pacific on the Manila galleon, and cathedral treasures accumulated over a century. The Spanish had drawn up a force of about 1,600 men to meet them on the plain of Mata Aznillos, outside the walls. The Spanish commander, Don Juan Perez de Guzman, had also assembled 2 herds of cattle, roughly 1,500 head, which he intended to stampede into the buccaneer lines. The plan misfired spectacularly. The cattle, panicked by the buccaneers' musket fire, turned and stampeded back through their own herders and infantry. The Spanish line collapsed in 2 hours. 400 to 600 Spanish soldiers lay dead. Morgan's men chased the survivors into the streets of Panama, then the city burned. Morgan blamed the Spanish, who he said had set the powder magazines alight to deny him the plunder. The Spanish blamed Morgan. Modern historians tend to think it was probably both. In the confusion, whichever it was, Panama Viejo, the old city, was consumed. Morgan and his men spent 4 weeks picking through the ruins and searching the outlying islands for the treasure Spanish merchants had spirited away by ship in the last hours. They found less than they expected. They also captured about 600 prisoners, most of whom they ransomed on the march back. On February 24th, they began the return crossing with 175 mules, laden with what remained of the loot. Halfway across the isthmus, Morgan halted the entire army and had every man, including himself, stripped naked and searched for concealed valuables from the common fund. His men were furious. The final share came to roughly 200 pieces of 8 per man, a disappointment given what they had endured. Morgan returned to Jamaica a hero. He was arrested in 1672 when word of the treaty violation reached London and shipped home under arrest. In the end, he was not prosecuted. He was knighted by Charles II and sent back to Jamaica as its deputy governor, a position he held until his death from cirrhosis in 1688. The city of Panama was rebuilt several kilometers to the west in the location where modern Panama City now stands, and the ruins of Panama Viejo still sit on the eastern edge of the modern capital, a tower of blackened stone that has become a national monument. Morgan's march remains by any measure the deepest inland penetration ever achieved by pirates against a major imperial city. He did what a regular army could not have done with 3 times the men, and he did it starving. Number 3, Henry Every and the Ganji Suai, September 1695. Now we come to what most contemporary observers called the single richest robbery in the history of piracy up to that date, and probably the most consequential in geopolitical terms. Henry Every was a 30-something English sailor from Devon who in May 1694 led a mutiny aboard the privateer Charles II while she was anchored at La Coruña in Spain. He renamed her the Fancy, sailed her around the Cape of Good Hope, and set up at Madagascar as the flagship of what became known as the Pirate Round, a new circuit of English and colonial pirates preying on the shipping of the Indian Ocean. Every was going after the greatest prize of the age. Every year, ships of the Mughal Empire sailed the annual pilgrimage from Surat in India to the Red Sea and back, carrying pilgrims to Mecca, and on the return voyage, an immense quantity of gold, silver, precious stones, and pilgrimage revenue. Every was going to intercept it. In August 1695, Every joined forces with 5 other pirate captains, including the American privateer Thomas Tew, forming a squadron of 6 ships and roughly 440 men. He was elected admiral. They positioned themselves in the Bab el Mandeb Strait at the mouth of the Red Sea the narrow choke point through which the entire Mughal pilgrimage convoy of about 25 ships would have to pass. They missed the main body in the darkness, but on September 7th, they caught up with the two stragglers, the escort ship Fateh Muhammad, which Tu's crew took after Tu himself was killed by a cannon shot to the belly, and then the flagship itself, the Ganges Sawai. Her name meant exceeding treasure. She was 1,600 tons, mounted 80 guns, and carried 1,100 people, of whom several hundred were armed soldiers. She was bigger than any pirate ship afloat. She should have crushed the Fancy. She did not. In the first minutes of the engagement, Every's cannon put a shot through the main mast of the Ganges Sawai and dropped it across her deck. Almost simultaneously, one of the Ganges Sawai's own guns exploded on firing, killing gunners and starting a fire. The Mughal captain, according to eyewitness accounts, collected by the Mughal authorities, afterward abandoned his post and hid below decks. Every brought the Fancy alongside and boarded. What followed was a 2 to 3 hour hand-to-hand fight through every deck of the ship, followed by several days of atrocity. The pirates raped and tortured passengers to reveal the location of concealed valuables. A number of the female captives, some of them relatives of the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb, were reported to have thrown themselves overboard or committed suicide with concealed daggers rather than be taken. When the pirates finally left, they had captured, by the lowest sober estimate, 325,000 pounds in gold, silver, and jewels, and by higher contemporary estimates, as much as 600,000 pounds. In today's purchasing power, this is well over 100 million pounds. The political consequences were greater than the money. Aurangzeb, ruler of the wealthiest empire on earth, was so enraged that he ordered the closure of all English trading factories in India at Surat, Bombay, Broach, Agra, and Ahmedabad. Armed Mughal forces surrounded the English East India Company's compounds and threatened to expel the company from India entirely. The company came within weeks of losing India in 1695. It survived only by promising Aurangzeb full financial compensation for the losses, filing an insurance claim of 350,000 pounds in the process, and by committing to hunt down Henry Every. The English crown put a bounty of 500 pounds on Every, later doubled and specifically exempted from any royal pardon. The result was what historians describe as the first truly global manhunt in human history. Notices went out in every English colony from the Bahamas to Bombay. 6 of Every's crew were eventually caught, tried in London, and hanged. Every himself vanished. He was last reliably reported in Ireland in 1696, and after that history loses him entirely. He may have died in poverty in Devon. He may have died wealthy under an assumed name. Nobody knows. What is certain is that he pulled off the greatest single haul in the history of piracy, and he got away with it. Number 2. Piet Hein captures the entire Spanish silver fleet, September 1628. In the whole 250-year history of Spain's Carrera de Indias, the annual convoy that brought the silver of the Americas to Seville, only one outsider ever captured the whole flota. His name was Pieter Hein. He was born in the Dutch port of Delfshaven in 1577 to a poor fishing family. At 20, he was captured by Spanish galleys and spent 4 years chained to an oar as a slave rower before being exchanged. It is worth pausing on this. The man who would eventually take the greatest silver haul in Spanish naval history began his career staring at the back of a Spaniard while a Spanish overseer whipped him for rowing too slowly. He remembered. By 1628, Hein was a vice admiral of the Dutch West India Company, which had been chartered specifically to attack Spanish colonial shipping. He put to sea with 31 warships, 2,300 sailors, and 1,000 marines. His mission was blunt: take the treasure fleet, the Nueva España Flota, the branch of the annual convoy that carried the silver of Mexico and Central America to Seville, was expected to make its rendezvous with the escort galleons off the north coast of Cuba in late August or early September. There were 21 Spanish ships in the flota under the command of General Juan de Benavides y Bazan. It carried the concentrated wealth of a year's mining in New Spain. On September 8, 1628, Hein caught them. The Spanish had been partially warned that a Dutch fleet was in the region thanks to a Dutch cabin boy who had gotten lost on the island of Blanquilla and been captured and interrogated. But that warning had gone to a different Spanish squadron off Venezuela. Benavides was still sailing north from Veracruz in ignorance. When Dutch sails appeared on the horizon, he panicked. Rather than form a defensive line, he ran his 4 largest galleons and 12 merchant ships into the shallow water of the Bay of Matanzas on the Cuban coast, deliberately grounding them in the hope that his crews could escape overland to Havana. Hein's smaller Dutch sloops rowed in after them. After a handful of musket volleys, the entire Spanish squadron surrendered. 16 vessels taken. Not one Dutch sailor was killed in the action. The haul was so vast that Hein spent days on the Cuban coast simply counting it. Silver ingots, gold, pearls, indigo, cochineal, red dye, hides, and in a detail that historians have always found charming, several tons of raw cacao beans still in their bags, marked for shipment to the confectioners of Seville. The Bay of Matanzas capture is, so far as historians can tell, the moment that chocolate first arrived in the Netherlands. The total prize came to roughly 11.5 million Dutch guilders, 177,000 Dutch troy pounds of silver bullion alone. The Dutch West India Company paid its shareholders a 50% dividend that year, unprecedented in its history. And the strategic effect was even greater. The captured silver was used to finance the Dutch army under Frederick Hendrik for the following year, which allowed the Republic to besiege and capture the Spanish stronghold of S-Hertogenbosch, one of the largest Dutch victories of the entire 80 Years' War. Piet Hein had, in a single afternoon, funded a European war. In Spain, the consequences were bureaucratic and permanent. General Benavides was arrested, tried, imprisoned for 6 years, and eventually beheaded in 1634 for cowardice in the face of the enemy. The Spanish crown declared bankruptcy again the following year, its 5th. The convoy system was rebuilt with heavier escorts at greater expense, and Spain's ability to fund its wars in the Netherlands never fully recovered. Piet Hein did not live to enjoy his triumph. He was killed 9 months after the Matanzas capture, in June 1629, by a chain-shot cannonball to the shoulder during a routine action against Dunkirk privateers in the North Sea. He was 51. To this day, Dutch children still learn a song about him, Piet Hein, Zijn naam is klein, whose lyrics translate roughly to Piet Hein, his name is small, his deeds are great, he took the Silver Fleet. It has been sung for 400 years, and no other pirate captain in history has a nursery rhyme. Number 1. Jean Fleury takes Montezuma's treasure, 1523, and now, at the top of this list, the raid that started everything. In August 1521, after 2 years of siege alliance, disease, and slaughter, Hernán Cortés and his conquistadors finally took the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. The wealth they extracted from the palaces of Moctezuma II and his successors was so vast that the Spanish clerks who inventoried it were still counting into 1522. When they had finished dividing the plunder among Cortés, his officers, and the crown, a substantial portion was set aside for shipment to Spain, personally addressed to the Emperor Charles V. It included worked Aztec gold, silver, ceremonial masks, feather headdresses, jade jewelry, cocoa beans, pearls, and a menagerie of live exotic animals which the Spanish had never seen before. Alongside it went Cortés's official dispatches describing the conquest of a hitherto unknown empire. This shipment sailed from Veracruz in July 1522 aboard 3 small caravels commanded by 2 of Cortés's captains, Alonso de Avila and Antonio de Quiñones. It stopped in Havana to resupply, then set out across the Atlantic in the late summer. No one in Spain, no one in France, no one in Europe, outside of a handful of Spanish officials, had any real idea what was coming. Waiting off Cape St. Vincent, at the southwestern tip of Portugal, were 5 armed ships flying French colors under a Norman captain named Jean Fleury. Fleury was in the employ of a shipping magnate from Dieppe named Jean Angot, and he was operating with a French letter of marque during the ongoing war between Francis I of France and Charles V of Spain. He was not looking for Aztec gold. He did not even know it existed. He was cruising the shipping lanes for any Spanish or Portuguese prize that came his way. In the early summer of 1522, the 3 Spanish caravels came up over the horizon. Fleury signaled the attack. 1 caravel escaped in the chase. The other 2 were taken after only token resistance. They were, after all, small unarmed transports. When Fleury's men broke into the holds, they found something they could not process. It was not gold in the shape they knew gold. It was masks with turquoise inlays. It was ceremonial daggers with obsidian blades. It was live jaguars in wooden cages. It was pearls the size of hazelnuts. It was 3 chests of Aztec featherwork so exquisitely made that when Fleury later showed them to Francis I, the French king was said to have gone pale. Fleury sailed for France, unloaded the treasure at Dieppe, and delivered the choicest items to the French crown. The rest went to his crew. Contemporary estimates of the value in modern terms range wildly, but the low estimate is roughly 30 million, and the high estimate is closer to 100 million pounds. The consequences were epoch-defining. Fleury did not just get rich, he blew the secret wide open. Until 1522, the wealth of the New World had been a Spanish rumor sustained by careful control of who knew what, who could sail where, and who could talk about it. After Fleury, every court in Europe, every merchant house from Antwerp to London, every port town shipfitter from Rotterdam to Plymouth knew exactly what was coming across the Atlantic and knew that it could be taken. Fleury took the news, and everyone else took the lesson. Spain responded within 18 months by inventing the flota system, organizing the treasure fleets into escorted convoys with dedicated warships, fortifying every major Caribbean port, and building the first true blue water navy the modern world had seen. The costs of protecting the silver drained the Spanish crown across the entire 16th century. Meanwhile, the French corsairs of Normandy, the Dutch sea beggars, and the English sea dogs, all of them, took Fleury as their model. Francis Drake was 20 years away from being born, but the road that led him to the mule train at Nombre de Dios was cut on the day Jean Fleury boarded Alonso de Avala's caravel. Fleury himself did not enjoy his fame long. He kept raiding. Between 1522 and 1526, he assembled a fleet of 8 ships in partnership with a fellow captain named Jean Tyrrhenian, and together they captured over 30 Spanish and Portuguese vessels. In 1527, off the Spanish coast, his luck ran out. A Spanish squadron caught him, and Fleury was taken prisoner. He was hauled overland to the Spanish court, imprisoned, tried and hanged the same year, aged around 40. His body was thrown in an unmarked grave. Charles V personally signed off on the execution. It was the first legal execution of a foreign privateer for piracy in the modern era, and the Spanish crown made sure the message traveled. It did not matter. The world Fleury had opened up could not be closed again. 3 caravels off Cape St. Vincent in the summer of 1522. That was all it took. Every pirate story on this list, and 100 more that could have made it, descend from that afternoon. 10 raids, 3 continents, 400 years of history. From Jean Fleury blowing the secret of the New World in 1522, to Zheng Yi Sao humbling 3 empires and retiring to a gambling house in 1810. These were the moments when piracy stopped being a nuisance and started being a force in world history. Some of them changed the shape of empires. Some of them changed the map of Europe. One of them, in the space of a single 2-hour afternoon in 1522, changed everything that came after. If you have a favorite raid that missed this list, and there were dozens we could have chosen, drop it in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. History remembers the treasure fleets, but it should also remember the men and women audacious enough to take them, and the coasts, empires, and centuries that never fully recovered.